Helga Relations. The date is December 29th, 1992. Okay, where we left off was you joining the English Army.
That's correct.
And you did you want to backtrack a little bit about your friend?
Just want to mention something that I thought about is, I mentioned my girlfriend Dorothea, who was my closest friend. I suppose it's something like your first puppy love. She was the person in my life as long as I can remember. And when I left Germany, I promised that I would do everything in my power to try and see whether I can get her to come to England just like myself. And once again, I went from door to door in our apartment complex to see whether there was anything possible to get somebody to guarantee her living like mine. In London. That was before the war, of course. And would you believe, I was again so fortunate, I found a lady who was perfectly willing to take her. And I can't even begin to tell you how I felt to think that my best friend would be with me, and we would go through things together. And the lady went ahead and made all the applications, and everything was set for her to come to England, and the war broke out. And I'm trying to write down my experiences in a book for my children. And one of the subjects was this friend of mine who meant so very much to me. And even today, I mourn her because she was just so wonderful. And I am also a member of the Children's Transport Organization, which is in New York, and I did write to them, and I did mention, that if anybody knew about her, but of course I never have gotten an answer, which means to me that, of course, obviously she perished.
So you never did find out?
No.
And she was Jewish?
Yes, she was Jewish, yes. In fact, her father was taken at one time to prison, but he fortunately came out, but we never found out what...
What was her last name? Dorothea?
Loewy.
Spell?
L-O-E-W-Y, Loewy. And they never found out. But her father did come back. She was just a wonderful girl, and I miss her, even today. I even miss her today, even of all these years that that I've gone through so many experiences, and I have really and truly wonderful friends. Really wonderful. I've been extremely fortunate. Friends to me are very, very important. It's one of the very important things in my life. And I have been very fortunate to say that the friends that I have, partially from the Army, I have kept in touch with the gal that I was in the service with. We've been friends since 1942. They come and see me every year. We see them. So all the friends that I have made are not acquaintances. They're friends. They mean a lot to me. I work at it. You have to work with friendship, but very important to me. It's been all my life like that. I suppose it's something that you do because you have lost your family, so you're looking somewhere else for something that is yours to keep, and that's why. And some of the friends that I have are not Jewish, but they're wonderful friends. They are just, they've been magnificent. I mean, that's all there's to it. I feel very fortunate to have them. But that, I did want to mention that because that was so terribly disappointing, dreadfully disappointing. But going back into the Army, we had wonderful times in the Army. I have people all over in England, in Australia, that we're still in touch with after all these years after I left.
What was your job in the Army?
I was in the mess hall. We served people and did the food and cleaned the dishes and so on. the Allied platoon was not allowed, the Allied girls were not allowed to do a lot of things that the ADS was allowed to do, the Army, the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Other girls, English girls, of course, could do other jobs. We didn't get quite those jobs, obviously. But it was a good group of people. We were all, as far as education-wise, we all more or less had the same education. We all were pretty well versed on everything. You lived with women morning, noon to night. You slept with them, you ate with them, you worked with them, you went out to dances with them. It was day after day, it was the same people. You learned to get along with people. You really learn to get along with people. I mean, not everybody's your bosom friend, but you learn to get along. And it's a wonderful experience that I wouldn't give up for anything in the world. And like I said, I think partially why the service meant so much to me is because I did grow up. 17 and a half is not exactly a very mature person. I had a lot of courage. I just recently read a letter that my guardian wrote to me, who since has passed away. And she said something about, I admire your courage. I don't think that I was so courageous. I think what I did is I did this self-preservation. You put up a wall, an invisible wall, and you decide that you will make the best of things, and you will always try. I always try to find some kind of fun or make the best somehow or other, that I would not. I don't believe in sitting down and crying. It's not that I don't cry, but in fact, one of the children asked me in the Anne Frank, during the Anne Frank exhibition, was a young girl. She was a Girl Scout. And when I spoke to them, she said to me, I have a question. And I said, what is it? And she said, did you cry a lot? And I said, yes, I did. And then she looked at me and she said, do you still cry? And I said, yes, I still cry. Which meant to me that obviously I must have related to her somehow or other. She must have understood what I was talking about, because she was very young. And so she realized, obviously, what it must have meant to leave your parents. And I reiterated it several times. Remember, think about it, how lucky you are that you have your parents and that you don't have to leave them, and think about your parents, how they would feel. And I don't know whether I could have had the courage that my parents had. I really don't. It must have been unbelievable to send your only child into a strange country, to strangers, and you don't know whether you see them again. They didn't. Anyway, the Army was great, and I met my husband there.
What was he doing there?
He was with the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force. And I met him at one of the dances.
In what year?
1944.
And his name?
Is Hank. And I met him in February of 1944. And we were married in 1944, October the 18th.
While you were still in the Army?
While I was still in the Army. He was in the Army and I was in the Army. And our son was born over in England.
Gotta go back. What were you hearing about your parents?
During that time, I did bring we had Red Cross messages. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing that was allowed as far as any kind of correspondence that you could have with your parents. They were papers that you signed, and all you could get on those little papers is, I am well, I hope you're well, I hope everything is all right. And they would get that Red Cross message. All went through the Red Cross, International Red Cross. Then you would get their answer. It would say, I have some of them, we are fine, don't worry, be thankful. What can you say in less than 25 words, right? Then in 1942, it stopped.
You would send and you would get nothing back.
Nothing. And then I came, let's see, we were married in 1944. I came to the United States in 1946, February 1946. And then I got in touch. No, the U.S. Army got in touch with us, with my husband and myself, that they had some papers that they had received from these friends that I mentioned that I went to school with. And they had carried those papers that my father had given them that he felt were important, carried them all over Germany because they fled Berlin, and the husband was sent to Poland. And they carried those papers all the way with them because they felt that they had promised my father that they would keep these papers, and if the war was over at one time or another, they would see to it that these important papers would come to me.
Were they not Jewish?
No, they were not Jewish. In fact, not only were they not Jewish, they were very good friends of my parents. And when my parents were picked up to go to camp, they took it upon themselves, the mother and the daughter, to go to the station because my father had left a note for them saying, it's all over now. So they knew, I'm leaving such and such a station. So she and her daughter went to the station, even though all the SS and all the guards were there. They took food with them and gave it to my parents to be sure that they would not be without food on the cattle car. That took courage, a lot of courage, because they were certainly in great danger. But they were also Catholic, and they went to Catholics. You know, she went to Catholic school with me, and we were good friends, and they were the ones who carried the papers with them. And through them keeping those papers, after the war was over, the girl managed to work for the U.S. Army. She then told them that she had these papers, and through that, they managed to get her father back from Poland, back to Berlin, because they had helped out. So you see, it is amazing, little tiny things that you don't give any importance to, how important they do become in your lifetime, because through that, I received some of the papers, and I found out some of the things that had happened. Of course, I knew that they had gone to Auschwitz because there was a list after the war, after the European war was over with, where you found out whether your people, where the people went to. Germans are notorious for keeping outstanding records, and that is how I knew that they went to Auschwitz. My grandmother went to Theresienstadt, and my parents went to Auschwitz, and there was nobody left. Nobody. And so that is how the papers got to me, and that is how I then managed at least a little bit to approach the German government to have some retribution for some of the things that happened. But our son was born in England.
When was
1945, in July 1945. And it is amusing when you think about it, how ironic that I married somebody who was Catholic. Fortunately for me, he was not very religious. And we discussed at great length before we were married what would happen and how we would go about the religion. And we did get married in church. My whole camp came to see us. And one of the things that I had to promise, is that the children would be brought up Catholic, which was perfectly all right with me because I didn't want the children to go through anything that I had gone through. And my husband and I decided that by the time that they were old enough to know what they were doing, it was up to them to choose what they wanted to do, what religion they wanted to be, whether they wanted to be any religion, whether they wanted to be Catholic or Jewish. As it turns out that neither one of my children are either Jewish nor Christian. My son would say he's agnostic, and my daughter certainly feels Jewish. It turned out, ironically enough, that she had all Jewish friends. We lived in California, and she turned out to have all her friends were Jewish. She was a counselor at the Jewish Community Center. It was really amazing. Made me very happy. And everybody that I knew would say to me, "You're so lucky. I'm sure that Debbie will marry somebody Jewish." Well, of course, it didn't turn out that way, but that's neither here nor there.
When you first came to the States, where did you live?
We lived in Vermont,
Where
and
his
it was
husband is
horrible.
from.
Yes,
Why
it was
was it
horrible. It was horrible in as much as, in the first place, you know, Vermont is not exactly the state that you want to come to as a stranger. New Englanders are known to not accept people that are not from New England, and I was a stranger. In fact, there was a write-up in the paper about me. Again, now I was a war bride, I was German, I was Jewish, I had lived in England, I had been an enemy. I mean, it was all strange, and I married a Catholic man. I mean, how much more can you have?
What did his family think?
His family was wonderful. His mother and father accepted me greatly. It was, you know, we thought it out very carefully, although we were very young. I got married at, we got married in 44. I had to have permission even to get married.
From your guardian?
I had to get permission from my guardian. I wasn't 21 when we got married, and it was very difficult. You know, we had to have permission from the Bishop of England to get married in church. There were a lot of difficulties, but that was all overcome. And I will say to you that it has nothing to do with whether I'm from Germany or where I'm from. If you want a marriage to work, if you're not of the same religion, it can work. It can work. Believe me. You have to be very tolerant. My husband, when we first went to California, I remember I felt that I wanted to go to synagogue, so he came with me. And it was the first time that he wore a yarmulke, which he didn't know what it was, but he did go with me. And we are very, as a matter of fact, the children were brought up Catholic. And I had no objections against that. They both made their first communion, and after that, that was it.
Did they go to Catholic schools?
My son did, we moved from Vermont to Indiana after a year, and he went to Catholic school, and then when we went to California, he didn't. We lived in California for 35 years.
And where?
Long Beach,
What did
California.
your husband do?
He worked for McDonnell Douglas Aircraft, and I worked for the Broadway department store for 26 years as a manager, and retired from there, and my husband retired from McDonnell Douglas. And we've been married now since 1944. That's a long time. And he's been a wonderful husband, and I can honestly and truly say that religion, with all the, no marriage is ever without some kind of a disagreement. That is one thing that never, ever, in all those years came up, ever. He is particularly cognizant of the fact of the German situation. He's very much involved as far as, history must not be repeated, it must be told. Children should know the history of the family. And
That's what I was going to ask you. Did your children know about your history?
yes.
From what age? At an early age?
Do you mean, what do you
When
mean?
did you begin to tell your children about what you had?
The children knew as long as I can remember. I would always discuss it. It is a funny thing, I must tell you, that Germany invited me, which a lot of them did. Berlin invited us to go back, and I went back in 1986. It was an invitation from the mayor, and we went to Berlin. I had been to Berlin before. And we went to that, and I spoke to people who came out of a concentration camp. And I asked them why they went back to Berlin rather than leave the country. And the answer was, where else should we go? This was the country where we lived. And one of the very interesting things was that when they talked about their children, that the children don't want to know about it. They are sick and tired about hearing about it. And I had great, lengthy discussions about that. And this one fellow that had come out of Auschwitz had said to me, he said, the children don't want to hear about it anymore. They have heard it and heard it and heard it, and they don't want to hear about it. And I said, but that's not the answer. And they said they've lived with it. So I suppose they were tired of hearing about it, I don't know. But I feel very strongly, particularly, I had been to Anne Frank's house before this all came up. And I feel that it must be told, it mustn't be forgotten, and people like myself, we're all dying, so somebody's got to know about it, And my daughter is more involved with it than my son is. My son is not, he's not a sentimental person, so.
Did you celebrate any Jewish holidays when they were growing up?
No,
Just
we
the
didn't.
Christian
No, well, Christian holidays as per se, Christmas because they get gifts, but I mean, nothing in particular. When our son was little, my husband did take him to church, because that's what I signed, and that was fine with me. I just felt that I didn't want them to go through what I went through. And funnily enough, I will tell you something else interesting. My mother's sister, they were not very fond of each other, was Jewish. Do you know that when things got really bad, she and her husband turned Catholic?
When do you think?
Would have been in 1900 and maybe 1940, during the war.
Did that protect her?
Of course it didn't protect her, but what they did is they left their money rather than to leave money to my mother. They left their money to the Catholic Church and then committed suicide. Then I had to fight the Catholic Church for some of the money. So Catholicism, or whatever you call it, has always played some kind of a part in my life without my really doing anything about it. It just came about through life. But that was rather amusing because that I found out, and I did get the death certificates from them. Yeah,
How did they do it?
She, I think, took poison and he threw himself in front of the underground.
And this was
In Berlin?
Same day? Or?
I don't think that was the same day. I think it was within a couple of days or 3 days.
And she did it first?
No, I think he did it first.
They had no children?
No.
And so you assume that your grandmother, no, that was the other side. Did your mother know about that, do you think?
Yes.
They were still in Berlin when that happened?
Yes, she did.
Did you run across anybody who had known your parents in Auschwitz? Have you ever?
No. Mm-mm. Never. Never have run across anybody. I gave money for, I think it was a tree in Israel, in Yashat. Yeah. I have, their name is there, and I gave money to that, so I'm sure that their name is on the wall or wherever it is, and I haven't as yet made it there, but I'm sure that one day I will, because I feel that it's something that I want to do before I...
Did you get reparations from the Germans?
Yes. Some. Never enough, but some I did. And...
when you were a young working person, a young mother in California, did you seek out any Jewish contacts?
I had some. I had a cousin that was Jewish, and she had all Jewish friends, and I had some Jewish friends, but...
no organizations?
Pardon?
Were you active in any organizations?
No. No. I really didn't. I was just, trying to made a living, and then we worked. And no, I really didn't. I didn't even go to the synagogue either. I just sort of let it lie. But then, you see, I was never brought up Jewish, so it really didn't. I mean, the holidays I did. I think I went once or twice. When I first went to Long Beach, I went for the high holidays. But I didn't, it's a funny thing. I always felt that it was a little hypocritical. I knew a lot of people who would go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and that was the end of that. And I felt that that was rather hypocritical, because if you can't be a Jew during the rest of the year, why be a Jew just on a holiday? Which I found amongst some people that I knew quite extensively. And I found this wasn't quite my forte. Yeah.
If I can go back to
Sure.
transports.
Sure.
Do you know who are the transports under the auspices of?
Through England. It was definitely.
Specifically, organization.
Yes, it was an English organization. I think it was called the Jewish Refugee, some kind of a Jewish refugee organization that started it in England. There were 10,000 children that went from Germany to England.
And do you know what year the transport started and when they stopped at all?
Well, I would imagine that they stopped in 1939 by the time the war broke out, or shortly before the war broke out. And as far as starting them, I would say they most probably started at maybe the end of 37 or beginning of 38, I would say.
And do you know why they were tolerated by the German government, or were they clandestine?
I think that, I really don't know, but I have a feeling that I suppose the children weren't that important to them, because the children weren't any good to them. The adults were. The adults were the ones where they got the money. The adults were the ones where they got the gold out of the teeth. The adults were the ones that they wanted to get rid of. If children could leave, so be it. And they made it difficult for people to leave. But if they had a visa, as long as they left their money there, they didn't care. As long as they could make Germany an Aryan, Jew-free country. So children, I don't think, matter to them that much. I never found that there was any big deal about taking children. Of course, in the end, they took children because they took them, they took whole families. And then children, were taken as well. But under normal circumstances, when children could leave the country, they didn't make great difficulties. They just made very sure that you didn't have any money and that you left everything behind.
You said you were involved in an organization now of children who were transported?
Yes, it's a children's transport organization that formed in New York. And I heard about it, and I belong to it, but I haven't gone to the meetings, because the meetings are mostly in New York. There has been one, and I think they had one in California. I just thought that maybe someday I come across somebody, and I read the articles. It's interesting to hear about the different situations. You will laugh, of course. You see, I'm sort of a bit of a paradox, because I'm also a British war bride. Mm-hmm. So, you see, I came over on the Queen Mary with our son, so I was considered a British war bride. So, of course, I went to the British war bride reunion on the Queen Mary, which was for 3 years. And I'm in the book. They wrote a book. And so I'm in that book as well. So I'm sort of a little bit of everything,
Mixed identity.
Yeah, I really am, because, that was very important to me. And, it's England to me was actually where I grew up. To me, it was my second home. It was, I didn't want to leave. I really didn't want to leave. My thought of marrying an American was the last thing on my mind. Everybody else wanted to marry Americans. Everybody wanted to come to America. I had no desire whatsoever to come to America because I was perfectly happy in England. I had a wonderful life. I had friends, I went to school, I had my army friends. There was no reason for me to leave the country, you know. But when you marry an American...
When was your daughter born?
1949, 19th of June, 1949.
And where are your children now?
Here, in Portland. That's why we came here.
How did they-
We moved here in 1988. We haven't been here very long. They felt that we should come here because they're here, they have their children here,
How did
and
they end up here?
they wanted out of California. They didn't like
Oh.
California. They all moved together. My son and my former daughter-in-law and my daughter and son-in-law. They all moved together at the same time. They left us all. Yeah, they're very good friends. They're very good friends, and so they all left at the same time. They said, "We've had it with California," and so my daughter asked one day. She said, "When are you planning to move up here?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to move up unless I have to." And she said, "Why do you wait till you have to? Why don't you move up and you know, when you still can?" I suppose I had in the back of my mind, if my husband died, you know, I would come up. And once again, luck was with us. We moved at the right time. We sold the house at the right time. And we built at the right time. So I was very lucky. But I did think about it at the time when she talked about it, because every time we would see each other, we'd cry, and it was so stupid. We were down there and they were up here. But, you know, the time was right. We had both retired, and we were free to be able to leave, and that's what we did. And of course, we're delighted that we're here. And the funny part is that my daughter lives down the street from me. So basically, when I think about my life in general, putting it down like this, I find that I have been extremely fortunate. I mean, much more fortunate than many other people.
So you learned how to be close to your daughter. You learned
Oh, you better believe it.
how many grandchildren do you
I have three. She has a boy and a girl, and my son has a son. But she's my best friend. I'm her best friend. It's a wonderful relationship, and I learned a lot from my mother. What not to be, and how to be, and how to, you know, things that I always swore to myself as a child. I will never do this, and I will never do that, and I didn't. She's very sentimental. She's very much like my husband, and we're extremely close. My son-in-law, I worship the ground he walks on. He's absolutely, everybody should have a son-in-law like that. And so it's worked out extremely well. Like I say, I'm extremely fortunate. I mean, when I hear some of the stories that some of the other people have told, somebody up there must have watched me, because how can you be so lucky? There's an old story, you know, what is it? Sunday's child is full of grace, Monday's child is, etc., etc. Well, I was lucky enough to be being born on a Sunday. Maybe that's why, I don't know. But I was very lucky. It's some of the things maybe I had something to do with it, but most of the times I feel that I've been just very fortunate. You know, things could have worked out very differently.
Are any of the children being raised Jewish, or
No.
Jewish exposure?
No,
Grandchildren?
no, they're not. None whatsoever. I cannot. I can't do anything about it. You know what I mean? Neither one of the children are very involved with anything, to tell you the truth. Now, whether they will then turn eventually as they grow older, or they will learn more about it, I don't know. I have no idea. But I know people who do not want to tell anybody that they're Jewish. There are lots of people who will not admit that they are Jewish. To tell you the truth, I don't think about it. You know, for years in Germany, you always thought about it. You know, I'm Jewish. You know, you have to be careful. I don't do this, don't do that. As I went through life, it's important, but it wasn't that important. You know, you don't go up to somebody, will you be my friend, but I want you to know I'm Jewish. You know what I mean? it comes out gradually. When something happens or something, for example, we met somebody that we're quite friendly with, and nothing has ever come up about it, but then something came up about something about my parents, and all of a sudden the man looks at me and he said, "Are you a Jew?" And I said, "Yes." And I thought to myself, now what's going to happen? And he said, "Oh." And that was the end of the conversation. It struck me, I sort of shy back when somebody says to me, "Are you a Jew?" I think more of it as, "Are you Jewish?"
When did you start telling your story?
The story?
Publicly. Was the Anne Frank exhibit the first time? And how come? Why did you decide to do it?
I never had an opportunity to tell it any other time.
Had you wanted to?
I hadn't really thought about it. I always put it in the back of my mind. It's always been something that it's...
So you heard about the exhibit coming?
Oh, I heard about the exhibit coming. Since I've come to Portland, I heard about the exhibit, and when they asked for volunteers, I thought, oh gee, this is something that I must do. It's actually, since I've been here, I have found that, firstly, I find that the Jewish population in Portland is quite different than the one in Los Angeles. Which brings me to people in Oregon are different, people are different than Californians, I'm sure you know that. And I have found entirely different people, and I was so thrilled. I was so on such a high when I went to that. And when I became a greeter, and then I met, what is her name? Rosenbaum? Yeah. Well, I met her through the fact that her husband was also a refugee, and his name was mentioned in the Children's Transport paper. So then, it's all involved. Anyway, I met her, and I became a greeter, and then it came out that, that I was also a survivor, and they needed me, and they asked me. And I was a greeter with a girl who was not Jewish, who was part of the church, from the Methodist Church. There was a black man, and there was another girl who was Jewish from Boring, and myself. And we had such a wonderful time. And I was so impressed with this whole thing, because I felt that it just goes to show people can live together if they want to. People can do all kinds of things if they really wish to, because it was I was very impressed. I was very glad that I did it. I really was. And I met wonderful people. So that's when and then I met another gal here. You must probably know, Lotta Magnus. Well, I met her. That was also instrumental, because I had read her story in the newspaper.
I interviewed her.
Yeah, I know. But I called her. I didn't know her, and I called her. And I talked to her, because her main reason was because she was looking for her friend, and she found her friend. And that's when I called her, because it rang a bell, and we have become very friendly. So that's how I became instrumental in being asked to go to the B'nai B'rith meeting of the youngsters at the park. And that's when I talked.
For the tape, that was on the Holocaust Remembrance Day, was it?
It had to do with that. Remember, they were youngsters at the park, and so they asked me whether I would speak. And that was the very first time I did that. And that's how this all started. And then I felt, that was the very first time that I actually spoke. And I thought to myself, maybe this is the time to do something about it. I should do something. I've never done anything, and I should do something now. It's not too late, before it is too late. So I then thought, if there's anything at the Holocaust Center that I can do anything, I would be glad to do it. And whatever there's involvement, I would love to. It's time. It's maybe partially because of my own selfish reasons, because I didn't want to be reminded. because there's a lot of it that I don't think about, that I put out of my mind, because I don't want to.
That's what partly what being a survivor.
Well, yes, I suppose it is. But there comes a time when you have to face it. And this was put to me without my having to do very much about it. It was up to me whether I wanted to or not, and I felt this was the time, and I'm glad I did. And so, and Lotta, of course, was a little instrumental in it too, and so I thought, well, this is really great. So, but like I say, it's a little different than some of the other people that have done it. I've knocked around in the world a little bit, I've been back to Germany. That's another thing. I did go back to Germany, and I had very mixed emotions about going back, wondering, looking at everybody, whether they were the ones. Are you the one who was a Nazi? Are you the one who killed my parents? Are you the one? And then I learned that doesn't work. You have to, you can't live on that. You have to survive. You have to go on, and you can't think that everybody is that way, because there were a lot of people who weren't that way. They were very courageous. We just don't hear about them. I just happen to know one couple, These are my parents. This was when I was 15. This is when I was in school uniform in England, in my school uniform. This is my father, my mother, and my grandmother. This is my mother, my grandmother, and myself. I must have been about 13 there. And this is myself in the army. And this is my husband when we were, shortly before we were getting married. And this is one of the Red Cross letters that we talked about, messages that you get. I write one and they write the, and then I'll show you the other side where the answer is. This is the other side of it, where you get an answer. Somebody else writes it, of course, they don't write it. That's it. I think that's enough. I don't think you need any more. This is movies. I was so impressed that my guardian would let me go to a movie, because I wasn't allowed to go to the movies in Berlin. I was only allowed if it was a movie that was for children, and not over 13 you couldn't go, and it was all a different lifestyle altogether. I mean, had freedom, basically freedom that that you don't really call freedom, but to me it seemed like freedom, that I wasn't told all the time, yes, you can go to the movies, yes, you can do things that you couldn't do before. And I was very impressed with Mickey Rooney, and so people kept saying, I would say, please don't call me Olga. Well, what shall we call you? I said, why don't you call me Mickey? That is how my name stayed forever and ever. It's Mickey, 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 because it was so easy. Well, I think in July of 1939. Of course, things got worse as far politically was concerned, and it looked very scary. And my parents kept writing to me that they were getting ready to go to Chile, that their permit had been given to on the 8th of September of 1939. They were going to leave for Germany, for Chile, South America. And I thought that was very exciting. And while I was going to school, my guardian decided that it would be a good idea if I would go to Cambridge University, because she was a graduate from Cambridge University, and I should do the same thing. So you know how wealthy she was and how she felt that that is the kind of education I should have. By that time, I felt that I had graduated. I hated school. That was the last thing on my mind, to go to university. I thought it was horrible. I said, there's no way that I will go to university. So I was going to the secondary school, and vacation had started. We went away on vacation, and when I came back, it must have been about August, it looked like war would break out. And the London County Council decided that children should not be in London, because there was going to be bombing, and the children should be evacuated. Schools should be evacuated into the country. So I think it must have been just about the end of August when all these arrangements were being made, and the war broke out. September the 2nd, 1939. And I knew of that day that my parents wouldn't make it out of Germany. They wouldn't be allowed to leave. As of that day, all correspondence stopped. And I was evacuated with my school, once again, to strange people, leaving the place that I had known just for a short while, leaving the person that I had known just for a short while, and went with my school, and I was evacuated. And the first people that we lived with, I went with my friend from the class, was a Methodist minister.
Where?
In the country.
Where?
Byfleet, in London, outside London, in Surrey. There were 4 of us the first night. And we were staying, this was just before we got to the minister, because it was just for one night that we stayed at somebody else's house. And they didn't have a bathroom. They had an outhouse. And all of us were afraid to go outside into the dark. I mean, I came from Berlin to London to all of a sudden the country and nobody that you knew. So when we were evacuated to the minister, he was wonderful. They had 2 children, well, there were 2 of us, and I became the best little Methodist you had ever met in your life.
Was it a farm?
No, it was a home, and he was a wonderful man, and there was nothing to do. So on Sunday you went in the morning to church, and you went in the evening to church, and you got to learn all the songs. I was just like everybody else. You do what you do.
Someone else at his
Yes,
house?
I was with another girl from my class.
What was her name?
Can't remember.
Was she Jewish?
No. I don't remember there were any Jewish children in that school. There must have been, but I don't think so.
When you say children, were you with children your own age?
Yes,
or?
yes, from my class. See, I was in the grade that I was in was the same youngsters that were the same age as mine.
And how about on the train? What were the ages on the kinder transport?
I would imagine about the same age. They wouldn't have been too young, because you couldn't send you couldn't send children out that would have to be taken care of by other people unless they were relatives. That I remember, most of us were. I think I was one of the youngest. There were maybe some that were 16. I was 14, 15, and 16, I would say. Maybe 17. But that's the age that I seem to remember. Most of the people that I knew were about my age. So when I was evacuated, the London County Council paid for our staying with these people, they got extra money. And while I was going to school, the Methodist minister's wife got pregnant. And so she decided that besides her own 2 children and being pregnant, she really couldn't take care of 2 more children. So once again, we had to be moved. And in order to be moved, we had a billeting officer who made sure that we had homes. That was her responsibility, to find places for us. So this girlfriend and myself went to somebody else's house, and we had our room there. And of course, during the day we went to school, So
What kind of school?
it was the same school that I went to. It was a regular school. It was the same school that I went to in London, only they were evacuated to outside London. You see, the schools were...
Also.
The teachers also. Oh, yes, all the teachers. So really and truly, I just continued with the same children, with the same teachers that were friends of my guardians, but strange people. Strange people who didn't know anything about refugees, didn't know anything about Jewish people. They were people who lived in the country. They weren't interested. They were not, they didn't know anything about that. So here I was. I was German. I was Jewish. I was a refugee, and I didn't speak much English. And I was an enemy alien. So I had 5 strikes against me. Well, the people that we stayed with, I didn't like. I felt that they were, well, for one thing, the food that they gave us, they didn't give us much food. We were already on rationed food because, the war had broken out. And she kept a lot of the coupons for herself and for her family rather than us, and I was very unhappy there. So I went to the school and I said, I don't want to live there anymore. And they said, we're very sorry, but there's no place that you can go to. If you want to go somewhere else, you're going to have to find your own housing. So I thought to myself, fine, I'm not going to stay here anymore. So I went to the area where we were living, and I started going from house to house. And I knocked on the door. And people would answer, and I would give them the spiel that, I was at school and that I needed a place to stay. They knew that they would be paid. They knew all that. And I went into a very lovely district, and would you believe, I came across somebody who said, my dear, we don't have children, and we are very quiet people. And it was a lovely house, and I looked at her and I said, I am so quiet, you wouldn't believe it. And she said, well, we talked, and she said, we read a lot. And I said, I read a lot too. Anyway, I sold myself. And she said, well, I have to talk to my husband. We're really not used to children. And I said, believe me, I said, you won't be sorry. And so she said, I'll let you know. And do you know, I stayed with these people, and they became, without a doubt, the most wonderful people I have ever met in my whole life. They were wonderful. Actually, they were more wonderful than my guardian. Sears, Mr. and Mrs. Sears, they were absolutely wonderful. I matched so well into their home, and she was so kind, and I kept saying to her, I hate to say thank you all the time. She was so understanding. They were just absolutely wonderful. I kept in touch with her. I saw her in England till she was 93 years old. She was just wonderful. And it got to the point that even on my vacations, I would go and see her rather than my guardian. That's how close I was with them. She was like my second mother. And I stayed with them. I had a wonderful life.
How old were they?
She must have been in her 40s. They were a little old. They were younger than my guardian, but still they were in their 40s. And they were very quiet people. And of course, I wasn't really as quiet as I told them I was. And I got them to do things that they had never done before. Didn't go to the movies. They didn't, a lot of things that they got them to do. It was wonderful. I had a wonderful life there.
How long
And
did you stay?
I'm trying to think. There was in 1939, 1940. I most probably stayed with them maybe a year or so, because then I graduated from my secondary school and my guardian enrolled me in a trade school. I felt that she felt, being that my mother was such a wonderful seamstress, that I should become a seamstress, which I hated. I wanted to become a hairdresser. And so she said that hairdressers was not a job for me, that was, low class. And what would my parents feel if I became a hairdresser? And I said I couldn't see any difference. But then I did write to my father. And the way I wrote to my parents was through my boyfriend in Sweden. I sent the letter to him in Sweden, then sent the letter to Germany, because Sweden was not at war. And that is how I got my mail.
So you
At
did
that
hear,
time.
You did hear from them?
Yes. And he said, of course, it was outrageous that I could even think of becoming a hairdresser. I couldn't even think of such a thing. Couldn't I become a dental assistant? Because that's what he wanted me to be. Well, anyway, I was enrolled in the school, and I learned ladies' tailoring. And once again, the school was evacuated somewhere else, so again, I had to move. Again, I had to go to somebody new.
Originally it was in London?
Originally it was in London, but it had also been evacuated and was a different area where my secondary school was. So
Was there any bombing during the time you were in London?
no.
Did you
No, I left London before the bombing started. Bombing started much later, and while I was at the trade school, which was somewhere in 1940, 41, because I signed up in the service in 1941.
What did you hear from your parents about?
At that time, they didn't see a great deal. They would write that things were all right, that my dog was all right, mostly instructions what I should be doing, on what I shouldn't be doing.
Did you know if they were in danger?
I knew that through politically. They didn't write it. They would always say we're all right. My grandmother left her apartment and moved in with them, but they would say things like, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so are doing very well and they've been very nice to us, or we've gotten together with so-and-so and so-and-so.
Were they still living in the same apartment?
Yes.
At night as well?
Yes. They stayed there till 1942, I believe. 42, 43. They were there the very last. What I found out afterwards is that my father learned welding. And the welding that he had to do is he had to take down the gates of the Jewish cemetery. The other things that I learned after the war is that my father was one of the people who had to pick up other Jews, which was really pretty awful for me to think about. Then I suppose in order to survive, you must probably do almost anything. And I was so shocked when I heard it. But it didn't help, because in the end he got picked up anyway. But, you wonder, what would you do in the same situation? What do you do if you want to survive? What do you do for your family? How far do you go? And how far do you go to do something for somebody else? I don't know. I can't imagine what must have gone through his mind. Anyway, I went to this trade school, and the area that I was in Maidenhead in England, then the bombing started and we could see London burning. It wasn't that far away from London, but far enough so that we wouldn't be in the bombing itself. Bombing was terrible. It was dreadful, but you could see London burning. And again, I was with people who would say to me, "You're an enemy. You're Jewish, you're German, and you're a refugee." And then they would say, "Well, about Jews," I was always with people who weren't Jewish, and they would say, "But you're different." And I would say, "Explain to me what different means. Why am I different from other people?" And they could never explain that to me. You're different. I think what they meant is that, once again, I had assimilated to the way things were, that I don't know what their perception of Jews was. I don't know what their perception of Germans was. This was not London. This was outside London. These were people who were ordinary people who did not, most probably had their own faults, didn't have anything to do with Jewish people. Didn't have any inclination what it was like.
So then you were different than the stereotype.
That's exactly the right wording. The stereotype. I don't know what their stereotype was. English Jews are different than German Jews. English Jews are different than American Jews. They're different. All of us are different, but different countries are different altogether. Anyway, I went to that school and I graduated from the school.
The tailoring school.
The tailoring school. I graduated. And during that time, a lot of the refugees were being interned on the Isle of Wight. A lot of the German refugees were interned, and some of the people were sent into factories to work. And I didn't want to do that. So I signed up in the army. And I was 17 and a half years old.
Did you tell anybody you were going to
No.
do that?
But I had to have permission from my guardian, but I didn't tell her until after I had already signed up.
And what did she say?
First she was against it, and then she said, well, I insisted that I wanted to go, and she decided that she wondered what my parents would say about it. But then I was so adamant about it that she said, fine, I will sign that you can go, but once you go, you're on your own. Once you're in the service, you're in the service. You can't get out.
And your reasons of signing up?
I tell you what my reasons were. My reasons were that I wanted to do something for England. I was very patriotic, and I felt if I could help to beat the Germans and beat what was going on, then it was my responsibility to do so.
So your identity had shifted.
Very much so. My identity then became English. My guardian had introduced me to all different kinds of things, good music. I mean, it was a wonderful life. I was very lucky. I had a very, very good life. I've been very fortunate. And so I signed up in the army, and I was 17 and a half. And lo and behold, by the time I got to the station to meet all the others, every one of us was a refugee. We were in an outfit that was strictly what they call an allied platoon. We had Austrians, Germans, Hungarians, Italians, and most of us were Jewish. It was an experience I will, even today, that's where I grew up, in the army. Those were my friends, and I still have them today. It was an experience that was wonderful, because we all came from the same backgrounds. And all of us felt the same way. And most of us, I was the youngest, but most of them had been more or less in the same situation, had either come over on a children's transport or they were house daughters. Some of them had very bad